Good afternoon, everybody. This is a joint hearing of the Senate Finance Committee and the Senate Education Committee with Secretary Zoe Saunders and Jill Briggs Campbell, Deputy Secretary. And as you know, well, as the world probably knows, both committees have been spending a lot of time doing background work and preparing ourselves to understand the governor's education transformation proposal as it comes out. And I think today we are really going to get into some numbers about the governor's proposal for funding the foundation formula, about which we've been talking in general terms. So with that, do you have anything else to add?
No, the floor is there.
We turn it over to you.
Yeah. Good afternoon. For the record, I'm Zoe Saunders, Secretary of Education. Jill Briggs Campbell, Interim Deputy Secretary. Thank you for having us. Today, we did post material this morning that is a report that explains the foundation funding formula and also the presentation. We are moving as quickly as possible to provide all of these details, but we understand that you haven't yet had a chance to really review the report thoroughly. So today we'll walk you through and orient you to what you'll find in that report. And we expect that there'll be further conversations, and we'd be happy to come back and answer those questions more completely. Up until this point, we've been talking a lot about the guiding principles that are supporting this plan. Our focus is on promoting educational quality, educational equity, and sustainability. We have designed the foundation formula to promote education quality. And so we'll talk through today as we go through the numbers, just reinforcing the policy choices that were made that are in prioritization of achieving high student outcomes that are sustainable over time. So in this presentation, you'll have two resources. So the packet will have a lot more detail. It does follow the flow of the presentation. We will kind of pause throughout if there's questions that we can expand upon. And today, as Senator Bongart said, this is really around getting into the detail around the funding. So we're going to talk specifically around numbers and the cost and some of the assumptions that are built into those costs as it relates to educational delivery, as well as overall spending within this plan and how that compares to our current state. We are joined by our partners at APA Consulting. Justin Silverstein and Amanda Brown are on the line. So they will be walking through a lot of the details around the data. I'm not sure how I can share the screen and you see them. So if anyone has pointers for me, I can open to them. I know how to do that in Teams. But
otherwise, it'll just be a voice.
Otherwise, there'll be a voice. But let me maybe have them introduce themselves first, then we can share a screen. So Justin and Amanda, if you could introduce yourselves, and then I'll put the presentation back up.
Justin Silverstein with APA. It's great to be here.
Amanda Brown, also with APA. Good to see some of you all again. Now I'm in the box versus in the room. So good to see you.
Okay. With that, we'll walk through. Yes. So we're going to kind of situate you with NV. What we're going to talk about today is really related to the funding and explaining that, but this is situated within the broader proposal and assumes changes also to governance and education quality. So we'll be able to explain and make those connections as we walk through. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Justin and Amanda.
I'm going to kick it off. And so we will start off again, as the Secretary mentioned, situating this in the overall policy context. We will walk through the specifics of the base amount, the weights, and categorical funding. And then I'm going to then turn it over to Amanda to walk through kind of what that looks like at the actual funding levels for the new proposed districts in a comparison to the FY25 appropriations. You can go to the next slide. So in summary, what we've built here with the foundation formula is we began with the evidence-based model that was produced by Pikus and Auden. We've adjusted the resources in that model for Vermont context and resourced it to deliver Vermont's explicit policy objectives. We've added weights for student need, school scale, and district sparsity. There still is additional funding for categoricals, including special education and transportation. The funding system will be more transparent, it'll be more understandable, It'll be predictable for schools, districts, families, taxpayers, and the state. And it will ensure that resources are distributed fairly across the state. And so that students who have the same level of need are receiving the same level of resources, regardless of where they live. The plan is estimated to reduce overall spending by about $184 million, while still providing a generous funding model with those base weights and the categoricals. Those initial cost savings really assume no change in the school portfolio. So it's assuming all the schools we have today would still exist in the future. And there's some possibilities of additional savings in the future if there can be some additional governance and school changes. Go to the next slide. And so what does the formula look like? We have a base funding amount of $13,200, and then adjustments to student and some district characteristics, which will produce some additional weighted long-term ADM. And so we have every long-term ADM will be worth 1.0. Economically disadvantaged students will receive a weight of 0.75. EL students 1.5. CTE students 1.3. The triple E students, those earliest education students will still have the kind of a negative 0.54 weight. And then we have adjustments, as we mentioned, for districts, varsity weights, and size adjustments. And we'll get into more detail of kind of where we got to each of these weights here a little later. When you put all that together for each of the 5 districts, you'll have their total foundation funding. So that's the base plus the weights. And then they will still be receiving additional categorical funding for special education, transportation, state-placed students, and some other categoricals. Next slide. So all of this funding is really situated within the governance change that's also been proposed. And so that is laid out in the education transformation policy brief that was put out what feels like a long time ago, and it was like a week and a day ago. So, you know, that's laid out. But I think it's important when we go through these numbers to reflect on the fact that the system is being built, the funding formula we're going to discuss really is within that concept of 5 districts, which have been proposed based on the regions in the state. And the goal of those 5 districts is to, or the benefits really, is to lower administrative overhead, which by both reducing the number of districts who have separate central offices and allowing and getting districts who can operate at an efficient scale, improving those efficiencies that can be shared through sharing staff across schools in a district, and really focusing on achieving some of those evidence-based class sizes that are in the evidence-based model. There's the potential for reducing costs within purchasing and centralized services and through those contracts and fees. And then overall, it's really going to increase equity between districts in terms of the student need and the community property wealth that's available for the community. And on the next slide. So where are we today when we think of governance, and then where are we going? So on the left is your current layout of the supervisory union, supervisory districts. You can see, won't go into all the detail here, but all those districts in kind of the lighter color, your smaller SU, SDs, and in the darker color, the larger SUs and SDs. But you have 52 in that school year 25. And the proposal would be to go to these 5 districts on the right, all based on those regions. Go to the next slide. And so what do we look like when we think of the demographics of these new 5 districts? Much bigger districts, ranging from a little over 10,000 long-term AD or 2-year average ADM to over 34,000. Need ranges from about 36% for reduced price lunch up to 55%. EL ranging from kind of a 0%. There's some kids there, but as a shown as 0% up to 4%, and a relatively tight band for the net grand list per ADM. And so there are definitely the Southeast region would have the most grand list per ADM at 1.9 million, and the Northeast region at 9 million or 900,000. But the difference is only about 2.0 there. A little bit more than that. The current difference, I think, is over 10 when you look at something similar with the current SUs and SDs.
Good question.
So we have a quick question.
There's a question on this slide. So being a senator representing part of the Champlain Valley region, as looking at these numbers, did you consider 6 districts, just so maybe cutting that one in half so that the 2-year average ADM would be a little more balanced across the districts that you've proposed?
So the districts that are part of this proposal, we're using an existing construct of the Regional Superintendents Association. The logic behind that was that's already a forum by which educators are planning and collaborating together. Certainly, as we go through, there would be adjustments as you think about the central office and the district support that would be available when you have more students. But we do anticipate there'll be further conversations as we look at how to make sure that these districts are aligned to deliver on the quality.
Thank you.
And I just want to reiterate a point that Justin had said. So when we look over on that right, the net grand list per ADM, Justin, if you want to say again, our current system, what is that differential that exists? Because this is one of the advantages, and I think it's important. We're going to be looking at folks who have a lot of different ideas about governance structure, but one of these benefits is that we're really smoothing out some differentials that exist in our current system. And Justin, what was that current differential?
And I don't know the exact number, but the differential is at 10 or over 10 currently. So you have districts who have 10 times the net grand list per ADM as other districts. And again, this is shrinking it down to a little bit over 2.
So there's a lot of considerations that sort of went into this. That was one of them. When we started to see how this really smooths out some of those inequities, it was a little bit of a light bulb moment for us.
Okay. So now we're going to get into the meat of those numbers that we touched on earlier. And so if we go to the next slide, first we want to talk about kind of, again, the base amount, and we're talking about school year 24-25 figures when we look at all the information here. And I'm saying that and looking at Amanda's box to make sure I got that correct. It's the school year 24-25. So the base would be $13,200. Again, it starts with the evidence-based model that was put out late last year, and it adjusts for that Vermont context. The big adjustments for that context include increased college and career opportunities, which would include also CTE at traditional schools and not just at the centers, expanded electives and specials. That's especially true for middle schools. Additional student mental health, something that we have seen really being targeted and needed across the country. And we heard quite a bit about during the Listen and Learn tour in Vermont over the past couple months. Looking at higher teacher salaries, and then also rolling flexible pathways funding into the base. So not having that as a separate pot, but having it within the base available to all students who need that flexible pathways funding.
We have so just to set this up, I think it would be good if we get questions are good. I think it's fine to interrupt, ask questions just for clarity about where we are, right?
Okay.
And which I think is I suspect what you're doing.
Yeah, I mean, I have so many questions, but this one, you have a bulleted list of what this base amount includes, but how did we get to the 13,200? Where's the modeling? Where's the information behind that? Because this is just a bulleted list of things you're claiming.
Yes. So I think what might be helpful is we can kind of we'll go through the big numbers, and what we can do is drill down into those details within the report, and it builds in all of the assumptions that went into how we came to that number.
Okay, so should I hold off on my questions because so I just want to
Really
see what's
important
behind all these
questions. Yeah,
numbers.
absolutely. Absolutely.
And I think I just want to signal, we're in the section of the presentation that's called policy considerations. And one of the things that we committed to last week was to really make explicit all of the places where we made policy choices and really lay those out. What was the modeling and the rationale behind each of those? They can be discussed in a really explicit way. So that's really the intention today.
And so I think the point on this slide is we gave some context that we use the evidence-based model from the Picus and Auden report. That base amount is lower than what we're proposing. Part of the reason for that is because of these investments in what we think are really important education policy decisions and priorities for the state.
And so the recommendations for weights would be 0.75 for the economically disadvantaged students, 1.5 for English learners, 1.3 for CTE students. And I think it's important to note that the 1.3 for CTE students is not all the funding available for CTE programming. The estimate is that the CTE programming would cost about $25,000 per full-time equivalent CTE student. This would be going to funding to CTE BOCES that would oversee the current CTE centers. And so the 1.3 weight produces about $17,000. Then districts would be receiving the base funding for all of their students. They would send that $8,000 in, or the state would send an $8,000 in lieu of payment, similar to what's happening today, to the BOCES. Districts would keep the $5,200 to do a couple things, including covering some of the incurred costs districts currently have. The district is giving up the diploma. They're providing guidance services. Also, to mitigate some of what we heard, the tension between sending students to CTE or not, because you lose some scale and you can have difficulties providing courses for these students who stay in your high school. And so trying to mitigate some of that cost. Funding preschool students at a 1.0, and then keeping the current EEE weight at the negative 0.54. Kind of stepping into the part of the question that was just on the base, where this came from. We're looking at available research in Vermont. We have a list in the brief in the report of kind of all the different pieces we looked at. Each of the weights we have are really cost-based when we think of the economically disadvantaged weight, the English learner weight, and the CTE weight, so we can provide kind of how those were costed out, how we would get to them. And they are also, kind of compared to national comparisons. The EEE weight is based on current, and we have not done explicit further research on that yet, but it would be possible. So that, if we go back up, and we don't go back up, if you think back to the kind of layout we had earlier, we had the base, we had the weights, that got us to our total foundation funding for each of the districts. Then there's categorical funding on top of that. And so the recommendation is to provide additional funding for special education and transportation through categoricals, maintain categoricals at the current funding levels for state-placed students and other categories, including, I'm not going to read them all here, but you can see the pension normal costs, the OPEB normal costs, and some other uses. It would be recommended to eliminate categoricals for technical education, since that funding will be direct. EL through the weight, EL services, again, coming through the weight, and small schools, which will be provided through a weight. And so those will all now be in the foundation formula. When we talk about additional funding for special ed and transportation, what we're really talking about here was looking at the dollars that are currently being generated through district budget decisions to cover the additional costs of special education and transportation, and making sure that those dollars are being funded through a categorical, so that there isn't a lack of funding for special education and for transportation. And so the estimate for special education is $70 million, is currently being kind of generated through those local budget decisions above the federal and state funding for special education. And for transportation, the current reimbursement is at 50%. And so the estimate is the other 50% of about 25 million. Kind of the rationale here is the census block approach was really put in place to try to contain special education costs. So we do think keeping it funded separately and monitoring that is important. And then transportation in most states, and many states, is funded outside of the foundation formula. We'd keep that consistent here. And then keeping or eliminating the other categoricals is really based on if it's covered by the foundation formula or not. Next slide. Some really fun with logarithmic numbers.
A quick
Yes.
clarifying question,
Yes.
Senator Hinsdale.
Yeah, I'm just curious if how transportation funds are allocated. I imagine there are just some districts where you have to drive further to pick up students from more rural places. And how is that quantified and accounted for here?
So this is an estimate. So as we would move into this future state model, there would probably be more specificity needed as you actually think about the transportation patterns. But the state is funding that at 50%. So for this estimate, we're doubling that amount for the purpose of this first run of modeling.
Okay. So it's just not broken down by region yet.
And that's similar to other categorical grants. You all appropriate a certain amount every year, and then often through the BAA process that gets reconciled because it's either a little bit more because more students enrolled in X program, or it turns out it was a little bit less because there was less demand. So that's not outside of the realm.
I guess I'm hoping we save money eventually if we have.
Yeah, with transportation, I agree. Right now, we have many expensive contracts.
Yeah.
This is one of those places where I'm hopeful that we can achieve some economies of scale.
And it would be interesting to look at patterns of ridership as well. I would imagine that there are a number of buses that aren't full, right? And so
And they go
those are.
past each other.
And they go past, we've actually heard that through our listen and learn that superintendents were talking about, we see each other, this buses passing, on the road. So yeah, there would be some efficiency there too, and thinking about the logistics and the shared contracts as well.
So the last slide that I'll walk through really looks at the school and district characteristic adjustments. The recommendation is to adjust for schools for school scale and district sparsity, but not to adjust explicitly for district size. And the adjustments that we'll look at should be somewhat familiar or very familiar. For school size, the adjustment we've created is a smooth formula. So it smooths out your current adjustment, which has some cliffs. So currently you're adjusting for two different school size spans. If you're below one size or the other size, you get a different weight. What that means is if a school gained a student, they could lose funding, quite a bit of funding, or if they lost a student, they can gain a lot of funding on a per pupil level. We being APA tend to recommend trying to have something smooth in any formula. And so we did use some of the information from the AIR UVM 2019 study and the weights from that study. We also used information from the evidence-based approach and took a look at all that information to create this curve. We recognize that there has been some new information that was put out, I believe, this morning by AIR on what could be some possible school size adjustments. And so these, I just want to be clear, reflect the 2019 published work, not what came out this morning. And then the district sparsity adjustments, sorry, let me go back. The current adjustment for school size really focuses on necessarily or schools in kind of more sparse settings. We would recommend during the transition that all small schools receive this adjustment. And the adjustment's going to do a couple things. It's going to adjust actually for some schools that are larger than what you currently adjust for. And again, it's going to adjust for all schools. And we think that's a big piece of within a transition, not putting any district kind of on the back foot of having a small setting that's more costly to serve, but not having additional dollars available to adjust for those economies of scale. District sparsity adjustment at this time, we have not made any changes to the actual formula. We think that, and we can kind of go down on the rationale. I've already talked about the rationale for the school size adjustment, and on the district piece, we really are saying it's something that can be studied further, but we'd want to keep that in right now, knowing that you're still going to have, time to get the scale put together. And so you're going to still have some of these sparsity concerns. Okay, I'm going to kick it over to Amanda.
All right, and before I walk through the cost estimates, Secretary Saunders, do you think we should go to the report now? Do you want to go through the cost estimates first? What are you thinking?
I think it might be helpful to transition to the report because I think there's a lot of details just around what went into the funding formula and what that would be expected to support in terms of resources. So I think that's where we have a lot of questions. And then we can go back and seeing what that looks like in terms of the comparisons by the districts.
That makes sense to me.
I would suggest you skip ahead one and I do think the comparison slide to other states is helpful to articulate before we go into the report.
Oh, perfect. So this slide, we did a look at nationally other states in a couple key areas, looking at how do they fund their base, and then how do they fund at-risk or economically disadvantaged and English learners, kind of two of your larger adjustments that we're proposing. So what you're going to see here is the first column on the left is the proposed amount in Vermont. And the way we frame that at-risk and the EL funding is thinking about the dollars it generates, because a 1.0 base or 1.0 weight on a very low base will produce a lot less money than on a very high base. So we compared it on a dollars level. What you'll see is that the base amount that we're proposing would be one of the highest bases in the country. Justin, I'm looking to you. I think it was just maybe 2 other states, 1 or 2 that had a base that would be higher, DC and New Jersey, I believe. But the at-risk and the EL weights would generate funding at a level that would be more generous than any other state system. So coming back to the initial framing, the intention of this proposal was to provide a very robust and rich resource base for schools to be able to meet those education quality standards. And then we'll get into what does that mean for savings in just a minute here. And I'm not sure who's driving the screen, so I'm gonna look. Was it you, Zoe? Okay.
Yes, I'm going to transition to the report.
I think it's precious.
I think it's pretty good. Have it up on the screen now.
Great, thank you. So the presentation, as was mentioned, really mirrors the flow of this document. But what we want to highlight, if we start on, I believe, about page 6, is, well, actually, let's go up just a touch. I just want to highlight back to Justin's point that we really started working from, particularly for the base, from the evidence-based model that came out of the, I believe, September 2024 report from Pikus and Auden. But then we leveraged all of the other available research. And if you take up just a tiny bit, there is almost 10 different studies that have been completed in Vermont about the funding and resources and weights that are needed to provide an adequate education in Vermont, with some distinction that some of them are resource driven and looking at what level of resources do you need in the system. Some are more from that kind of tax capacity weight lens, but you really have a wide variety of research that was available that we turned to as we were making those policy recommendations that Justin went through. So if we go down now to scroll in the report, again, we started with that EB model that came out of the 2024 Pikus and Auden report. And it starts off in the report describing really what are the key resources that are in that model, from the class sizes they recommend, being kind of the biggest driver of the cost, being 15:1 K through 3, 25:1 4 through 12. It also includes staffing for specials and electives teachers, instructional support like instructional coaches, and interventionist student support, including counselors, nurses, administrative support, and supervisory aides. So those are kind of the core resources in the EB model for school level staffing. We recommended a number, and then it also, has then additional resources, what we would call non-personnel areas. So your supplies and materials, your technology, professional development, those other costs that systems incur, and then resources for a district, and their district is a hypothetical district of 3,900 students, which is kind of where they identify as the point of efficiency, where on a per student cost level, your costs tend to be the same as you go up from there. You don't need to adjust from size. But where we went from that evidence-based model is then making adjustments to what was mentioned earlier to better fit the Vermont context and Vermont specific kind of policy objectives. So that's where those pieces about increasing college and career readiness opportunities, preschool, after school programming, student mental health come in. So if we scroll just a little further to the first table, I think, Zoe, you can see the highlighted cells are where we made adjustments to the EB model. And for more depth on the EB model itself and the research base that goes behind it, I would refer everyone to that Pikus and Auden report. We're focused really here on where did we make recommended changes. Again, these changes were to make it more specific to Vermont, because it was kind of a national model, looking at, again, both what is Vermont's context, policy priorities, what feedback are we hearing from the community about what resources they wanted to see in schools. So you'll see in table 2 that the highlighted cells were made adjustments. Table 3 is then the district level resources where we didn't make any adjustments. Again, this whole funding policy is really situated in that broader change to larger governance. So we didn't make any changes to the district level staffing because you're assuming schools that are at least, or school districts that are at least the size. If there was a different choice to have more smaller districts, then you would need to think about making resource adjustments from there. Table 4 then is, if we keep going down, those non-personnel cost areas. We did make a couple adjustments related to that idea of expanded college and career readiness and CT opportunities in your traditional both middle schools and high schools. So you'll see that there's an additional amount for CT reflected, and to our earlier conversation, rolling flexible pathway funding into the base instead of the separate categorical, assuming it could provide still at the same level of funding, the same opportunities that's currently happening for students there. So that is all the detail on where the base comes from. In that report, you'll also see background on the weights, including the range of weights or targeted funding amounts that were coming out of all those other studies that have happened in Vermont, as well as our methods for kind of validating the weights that were from those studies within the context of the EB model. So there's a lot to chew through there on how we got to the numbers from today's presentation. But I think we'll switch over to what does this all mean for the larger system. I think to the presentation, unless Zoe, there was something else you wanted to go through in the report.
I'm just going to pause to see if there are any questions.
Perfect.
So I guess between looking at pages 6 and 7, operations and maintenance looks really small and tidy. And I would think that needs to be broken out a little bit more. I don't even see on page 6 with the school level staffing. Am I missing somebody who does operations and maintenance there? So, I mean, it's in a different section?
Yep. So if you looked at table 4, I can kind of, and I appreciate this is us summarizing what was, I'm not sure how long Larry and Allen's report, a very robust report on each of the resources here. So I appreciate that it doesn't have some of the depth there, but you'll see there's a line for maintenance and operations of about $1,000. And the EB model comes to that number by estimating the number of such as custodial staff or maintenance and groundskeeper staff, and then your utilities and other supplies. So they look at all of that.
I just think that's going to vary a lot.
And I entirely agree. And I think we can, I'm not exactly sure what table number we would be at, but as we think about there's an adjustment for school scale, that was really one of our considerations when we looked at what would it cost to operate smaller buildings. Maintenance and operations costs is one that we do believe would be higher in smaller settings. So I entirely agree there is a lot of variability in maintenance and operations costs, in part driven by size. I think it's also a consideration for Vermont more broadly because you have quite a few kind of what we would call underutilized buildings, where you have very large buildings for a smaller number of students than they maybe have the capacity to serve, which does also drive up your maintenance and operations costs on a per student level. So we both tried to make an adjustment for here, but do know it's part of a larger, I think, facilities conversation in the state as well.
I'm looking at page 5 of this report under the evidence-based base funding amount. And then in the bulleted list at the top of page 5, it seems that these are key school level staffing resources. I don't know if these are assumptions or what we're basing it on, but could you overlay where these numbers came from? And more importantly, how do they compare to current staffing levels in Vermont? Are there currently only one library media specialist per school and one nurse for every 750 students? Or do you have any idea of what our current state is and how this overlays to that?
Yep. So that's a great question. So taking the first stab of it, they come from the evidence-based model, which looks at all of the available kind of best practice and academic research that identifies what resource levels are needed in schools that have been tied to kind of student achievement, have been shown to be statistically significant. So that is where they come to these numbers from. In terms of how they compare to other schools, I think I heard the comment variable. It is very varied across the state. What this looks like, I think those class sizes are going to be larger than a lot of places in your state. Vermont has pretty small, I think actually the smallest kind of teacher to student ratio across the country. So that one I could speak to are probably larger than what's happening right now, which is part of what's related to the shift in governance, maybe being able to get to this level of scale. I can't speak more specifically to like around the librarian and media specialists. I do know one of the adjustments that we made to the EB model was that nurse line. The EB model would say a nurse for every 750 students, which I think is like the National Nursing Association recommendation as well. But Vermont's education quality standards are instead 500 to 1. So that was a change we made from what was coming out of the EB model, which again is kind of more of a national evidence-based academic model, and trying to situate it better in Vermont. So I hope I answered your question as much as I could without some other data in front of me.
Quick follow-up. So just on this, is your estimated potential savings from this of approximately 180 million, does it really hinge on these assumptions in this bulleted list right here? Would you say that those savings are dependent somewhat on achieving these staffing levels?
I would agree that some of those savings are dependent on the system shifting in terms of its scale, both in, and I think we highlighted on the preceding slide, moving to that governance piece of the 5 districts that allows both for that savings at central office and well as perhaps more savings within your school level by sharing staff and things like that. It's definitely predicated on that. You could not see these same savings without making those changes to the system as well.
And one of the things that we highlighted in previous report, which was the Vermont funding system explained, because we have generally small scale, what folks in schools tend to do, and you can sort of see naturally why they do it, is they tend to round up. So if, based on, say, for example, with school nurses, our education quality standard is 1 to 500. We don't have a lot of schools that are 500, but rather than doing a partial FTE, the school just rounds up to 1. So part of what we've started to roll out as a resource for districts for FY26, but we'll really need to invest in and really provide as a resource through a transition period, is sort of more precise staffing that will better bring folks into alignment with this kind of more efficient system. And with that needs to go, a lot of support around how do you sort of rethink how you build a budget. And not just about like achieving these exact ratios, but also the educational kind of quality and delivery pieces that needs to go with it. So as per usual with all of this, it's not just about the funding. It's not just about the governance. It's also about the quality and delivery of educational services. All of those things need to go together. And so we just always want to bear that in mind. It's not just about getting to this little number and that's how we sort of achieve what we want. We've got to do all 3.
Yeah, and I do want to say one more thing. The evidence-based model identifies a very specific set of resources, but it's not intended to be prescriptive in exactly how you have to use your resources. It would still be the funding flowing to districts to make their choices. So I want to say the savings are predicated on needing efficiencies in the system, but does not mean we have to get to these exact numbers in the figures. That's still local decision. So just wanted to clarify in case. Thank you.
And there are other states that take what's called like a resource funding model, and they are prescriptive. Thou shalt hire one literacy interventionist. Those systems have not been shown to be effective in terms of supporting student outcomes. And you can imagine why, right? That sort of, the states for prescribing exactly what you hire. So this model is a description of a high quality system, but really allows for that flexibility and kind of customization that's really necessary at the local level. You may not need a literacy interventionist. You might actually need something else. And that's okay because the system is built to fund that.
Thank you. So this is, you did these cost estimates assuming that there would be the same number of schools that we currently have. That's what you said in here. I cannot understand how you're going to get any kind of savings with that. Essentially what you're doing is you are assuming savings in the way that you're calculating the base, because the base is based and the weights are based on the PICUS report and various other reports that assume a different model than what we have. And then you're imposing that on the model that we do have. Cutting down the number of people in your central offices is not going to get you almost any savings. And to Senator Brom Hinsdale's point, the facilities costs are grossly underestimated in this model. If you have the same number of schools over a broad, one of the districts you're proposing includes 4 counties with vastly different methodologies for how they deliver education and vastly different facilities. So it seems to me that what you're doing is you're saying, this is what we'd like. So let's base our estimates on what we'd liked, and then let's plop it on top of what we have with just a 5-district map. So I don't know, you're not layering apples over apples at all in terms of your cost estimates and the reality of what the system is.
So I think there's a couple of things here, and I'll let Amanda go further. The funding formula is assuming that we're able to deliver a consistent, high-quality education across the state. We know that we have currently a lot of variability in terms of how schools operate. So part of this shift would also include a shift to school operations and to school staffing. As we go into this phase, we have built into the first year transition an assumption that we won't be at optimum scale. And there's a cost for maintaining some of our much smaller schools during that transition period, so that the new districts have that opportunity to do the work of identifying where there are advantages of providing greater consolidation, so that you can pool resources and better deliver the range of services for students. And while the funding formula is not prescriptive, there are education policy considerations related to that, such as class size, that would be implemented within the first year.
But how can you achieve the class size changes
So
in the first year if you're layering on a class size change, a funding change, and a base amount of formula on top of a system before you've changed the system? All you're doing is saying, we're going to have 5 school districts and nothing else, and then recalculating everything. You still have to operate all the schools we have with teachers in the building and principals in the building and facilities and maintenance and buses moving around. So it seems to me that you have to start with a different funding amount and then move to your potentially move to your proposal. But starting with what your calculations are will vastly underfund the current system. And if you're claiming that this is going to fund the system, there will be no savings to what you're proposing. In fact, there'll probably be more costs to what you're proposing.
I think part of what we'll talk about the timeline is a 2-year transition to moving to the new governance structure and the new funding model. Part of that additional work is identifying where there may need to be some accelerated planning to get to that optimum scale. We know over the last several months, we've been providing a lot of support to central offices that are struggling to maintain critical vacancies and aren't stabilized. So there's some work that we would be intentional around doing and identifying those systems that could need more earlier support and making this transition to be able to achieve those policy goals, such as class size and other indicators of quality that will be necessary for us to make the shift into this approach.
So that's part of the on-ramp.
That's the on-ramp.
A 2-year on-ramp to a change this large is unreasonable.
Delve into that committees. Senator Beck.
Yeah, so correct me if I'm wrong here, but the way I read this, that you don't provide any weighting differentiation between kids of different elementary, middle school, high school, which to some degree makes perfect sense to me because these districts are going to have the same spread of kids throughout the district. But is there, as far as superintendents and school boards in helping them to direct resources to where they need to direct resources in the district, are there underlying policy recommendations as to the differences in educating these different grade levels, or is there maybe no difference?
I can, Amanda, start there. The evidence base, you can look at their resource allocation by grade span, and they actually, it identifies the highest cost in elementary because it has the much smaller class size of the 15:1 K through 3. So I think the simple answer is yes, there's information in the model that could lead, that would provide kind of the theory of action of where the differences in costs are. I think it's important to note, though, that theory of action is different than kind of your current model, which provides additional tax capacity at the middle and secondary level.
Yeah, and I would just add, you hit on a key point is the new districts would be K through 12. So that is definitely a consideration there that you're now not operating just as you're operating K through 12.
You were better.
Whatever you did,
You're better with the earphones.
what you just did made it, you can't hear this.
Okay, but I heard what, thank you. I was able to.
I didn't hear what she said. What did?
Oh, at the end,
Sorry about that.
We can hear you.
maybe if you could repeat the end for the whole group. That's fine.
Yep. So I was just saying that you hit on a really key point that the new districts are now K through 12. So you will be serving students across grade spans instead of perhaps having a district that has only elementary students or only high school students, in which point differentiated weights by grade span are really important. But less so when you have a K through 12 system. But then I'll turn it over to you, Jill, perhaps to speak through the policy decision around that district to school budgeting piece.
Part of the approach in terms of policy is having some parameters around equitable budgeting. And so that's really critical to make sure. The whole point of this plan is that those resources are going to students that need them the most. So there'll be some policy recommendations around how to effectively support equitable budgeting. There's some practices in districts across Vermont that are doing this effectively that we can build upon. I think to your point of making sure that we're resourcing the system and giving students that have higher needs, those higher needs with the adjusted weights. I think additionally implicit in this model that we built in were some assumptions around middle school, because you just talked about the difference between elementary and middle school, where we're able to build in funding for additional teachers to do more electives and college and career exploration much earlier in middle school. So those are a lot of the assumptions built in that would be tied to education policy considerations as well.
Thank you. Thanks for all your work. I know it's been a lot and I appreciate everything that you've been doing. And I also appreciate the notion and the idea of change, which we desperately need. So I appreciate that. I'm going to put my teacher lens on for a second and speak to how in the same way that children need to be well fed to learn, they also need to be in an environment that is stable and is not chaotic, and where they feel comfortable, supported, and safe. And when I hear a 2-year rollout, I get anxious. I can't imagine what kind of chaos this could create on the ground. And I really worry about our kids who, for many, school is their stable place. And going from home to school, sometimes it takes the first couple hours of the day just to settle them down. And I worry that I want to hear more, but I am concerned that this could throw our students into a level of chaos that could be really harmful. And I also just wanted to say that I'll just leave it at that for now. Thank you.
We share those concerns. Any change in a system can be very disruptive to teaching and learning. And so as we approach this work, it was expediency was important in trying to make the transition more quickly so that it wasn't protracted for students and creating a longer period of uneasiness or concern around the change. But that's also why we built in some assumptions that, the school portfolio would remain relatively consistent in that first year, understanding that this change does take a lot of time and that type of community planning would be needed when you think about the new districts and really ensuring that every community has a strong school, that you're really clear on the feeding patterns within those districts. So that is something that we're paying very close attention to. The governor also, in his budget address, signaled an interest to increase capacity for the agency. Those dollars are really designed to support in the field. And that's not just related to some of the operational considerations, but the academic support as well during this time period, because we know that we're all, focusing on kind of the big transformation work in the future state, but we're educating students now in classrooms now, and we need to support our teachers in doing that well. Read Vermont is a new way that we're supporting the field, which is much more focused on job embedded coaching and support. That's what we're looking to build upon as a strategy through the transition. And we heard that really clearly through our listen and learn as we traveled across the state. People are open to change, and many educators are open to change, but they need that change to come with support. So as we're building this proposal and sharing the details in parallel, we're really designing an action plan for the agency that we're going to really vet with our partners in the field to ensure that we're developing that support system in a way that's going to be effective and productive, not just getting us to the future state, but having high quality education in the interim of a period of change that can be very disruptive. So I just want everyone to know that we're very focused on education quality, not just in the future, but supporting that in the transition.
And if I can just add one more thing, Senator Gluck, one of the things that have also been talking about through the listen and learn, and again, like all three levers, right? So the funding, the governance, but also the quality. And one of those things that we've talked quite a lot about is what are the many, many, many things that our classroom teachers are asked to do right now that perhaps we could take off of their plates if we had a little bit more unity and a little less freedom. And I mean that in the sense of our choice to have highly localized decisions around standards, curriculum, different ways of teaching, et cetera, actually puts a lot of pressure on educators, particularly early career educators. I've said before, like, I can't really imagine being an early career educator in Vermont at this moment in time. It's really challenging to have to walk into a classroom with the sort of additional pressures of sort of the mental health needs of our students, plus asking them to do curriculum development, plus asking them to understand proficiency-based learning and grading, plus. And then, God forbid they change schools to a different district and have to relearn it. So we're being really intentional about what are the things that we ask our teachers and administrators to do right now, and what could we actually take off of their plates so that they can do the thing that they got into the field to do, which is teach and support students. So we feel that anxiety around this, and we want to be really intentional about addressing that. But that is why you'll hear me say, I'm going to keep saying it, we have to do all the things in this sort of proposal all at once, or else we will potentially increase pressure on the system. And we really do not want students and teachers to not be the focus of what we're doing.
Can I ask quickly before we do more questions? How much more time do you need on looking at the clock and thinking about our time and wanting to balance questions with you getting through the material?
I think it's up to you how you want to use this time. We do have a few other slides we can walk through, or we can continue to unpack around some of the specifics around the funding formula and the transition. Depends on how you want to use it.
And we do want to give you time to digest, the report has the tables and the charts and the modeling and the details and all of that. And so we also want to give you.
Let's get through the slides
Okay.
and then come back to questions.
Can I just say one quick thing? Because thank you. But this is intriguing to me. Because I agree with Senator Hardy. When I was looking at this model, I thought to myself, where is the savings going to be? You still need a certain number of adults to administer programming and to educate kids, whether or not you've got 5 districts or 150. But I think what I heard you just say, correct me if I'm wrong, is that some of this work is going to be assumed by the AOE.
Yeah, or like just, we've
So that's
talked
the
quite a
question.
lot about, so Senator Gould asked a really great question, which is, we just talked about the work that is currently being done in classrooms and in principals' offices and that kind of thing. And maybe it could be elevated up to the next layer or even a higher layer, right? So we've talked a lot about what are the different educational sort of entities and layers? What should their roles and responsibilities be? What is the necessary support that the agency or a district office or a BOCES, we're, sort of rethinking the idea of BOCES and how they can be actually a really powerful tool in this new system. And so, yes, like to your point, we're talking about sort of realigning kind of some of the roles and tasks that we've asked.
So do you have that? Like, here's what school will do, here's what districts will do, here's what BOCES will do. Like, where can you show, us that breakdown that you're proposing?
Yes, so
Especially because I think it's really important that we be transparent with Vermonters about what you're proposing, and we need those details.
absolutely. So we're committed to pulling together all of the details to, this week we were focusing on making sure that we could bring the numbers. We knew that was really critical, and also what are the assumptions built into those numbers. Certainly, these considerations around governance and scale are also implicit, and we're starting to share that. Next week, we will have a report that's around governance. So that will be around thinking about the role of the school boards, the role of the district offices, the role of the school advisory councils, the role that the agency can play in supporting that. So that is, I know really those are part of really important conversations as we're thinking practically, how does this work? And so we will bring that forward. And the other thing I would like to just note through all of this, we appreciate the questions. We want to make sure that we're capturing all of those considerations. We've done a lot of work to get to this point, but it's important that we're engaging in these conversations, that folks are raising their hand to say, have you considered this? What about this? And that's part of the reason we have formed policy sprint teams around these key content areas, and we'll be engaging with subject matter experts across state government and with our field partners and walking through the key components of this plan. So we've organized them by the key policy areas or content areas. So there's teams focused on career and technical, focused on pre-K. We're bringing them together to say, here's how this is built into the funding and the kind of associated policy decisions. What other things do we need to consider? We're not asking people to take a position on the policy as a part of that process, but only being there to raise their voices around the questions and making sure that we can document those considerations. Also bring those back to you and say, we've heard these additional considerations. We thought initially we'd be able to address it this way. Based on feedback, we actually think we may need to make some refinement to that proposal. So we do expect that to be evolving as we move forward. And we're organizing these in very, we were called sprints for a reason. It actually isn't a marathon. We're
We're doing a
sprints.
marathon over here and
Yeah.
also running a sprint.
And doing sprints so that we can kind of quickly come back. In all of these areas, we've done a lot of research as a state. There have been a lot of studies, a lot of analysis done in how we can best deliver pre-K and career and technical education and special education. And so all of that is coming into this holistic proposal. And I think that's part of the feedback that we have heard. So we've, as a state of Vermont, have passed a lot of legislation, and it's contingent on a lot of other pieces of the system. This is an opportunity for us to build on the research, build on the recommendations, best practices that as a state we've already committed to, and doing them in concert together. I know it's a lot, but we're also building on a tremendous amount of work that the state of Vermont has done and published and documented, and this is an opportunity to build on that.
Finish the slides.
Okay, I am now back into Zoom, so I got reconnected. Yes.
Little IT work over
Yes.
here on the side.
Use Teams.
Yes, we are used to Teams. You're right. Yes.
What I do with Teams.
We have to go to Google, we're really in trouble.
Yeah, everyone learns their one system and heaven help
Yeah.
us to go to a different one. So just a few last slides on those cost estimates and comparisons. For context, again, everything is in FY25 dollars. That is, again, not to say that this would be the funding that goes in place in FY25. It was just kind of the comparison year we're looking at. So this first slide is just once you apply those weights that Justin went through, what is the long-term weighted ADM that you get out of those? You'll see here we have the 5 regions. We also have that CTE BOCES where all the CTE FTE sit. And just naming that that's one place where instead of average daily membership, you're talking about FTE for students because you might have full-time or part-time students. But overall, I believe it's about 122,000 weighted students that would be in the system. That if we go to the next slide, when we multiply those weighted student counts against our base amount of 13,200, you can see the funding that we generate in that base. And I just want to reiterate again, the base is kind of your most efficient point. So then we make adjustments from there. So you have about 1.1 billion that's coming out of the base. Economically disadvantaged funding generates about another 360 million. EL funding is 37 million. CTE funding, here I want to introduce the idea of, we talked about there's a weight for CTE, and also a portion of funding that comes from sending districts. They'll retain a portion of their base funding for their students for all the services they still continue to provide, and then send this payment of about $8,000 a student, CTE centers. So in total, the CTE BOCES would receive 75 million. It costs about 50 million for the system once you net out kind of those in lieu of payments. We kept the EEE funding as is, which is kind of a deflator adjustment. You receive, each student is counted as a 0.46. So that's why you see these are negative numbers. It's that adjusting from counting them as a 1.0 in the base to a little less than that. Then these are the 2 columns that I really want to highlight as we think about that base being the most efficient point. We know that not every system in Vermont is at that point. Obviously, it has much larger schools. And makes assumptions that don't match with a lot of schools in Vermont. So we have sparsity funding for districts, again, using kind of your current approach in your funding formula to do that. And then some school size funding that increases from that base that we saw to recognize what are the other costs if you, your school only has 200 students or 100 students. And that, so between those, sparsity funding generates about 60 million and small schools generates another 64 million. So it's about, I believe on average, a 6% increase for every student in the state. It's about a 10% on average for every school. So altogether, that comes up to 1,668 or so funding through the foundation formula. We put that on the comparison line with the current education payment. I want to note there's some changes in different areas as well, so you can't just compare those together because there's now additional funding that's in the foundation formula and funding that we do separately. So the next line I want to highlight is that special education aid line. In the FY25 appropriation, it was about 265 million. We are proposing an additional 70 million there because currently local communities are making budget decisions that spend more on special education than they receive through state or federal funding. And so moving to a foundation formula, you want to account for that because they wouldn't have the capacity locally to raise those dollars. So we've increased there. We've kept state placed students the same. Transportation aid, we've again doubled, reflecting that you currently reimburse up to 50%. Since communities aren't making local budget decisions in the same way, you want to make sure you're covering transportation. I think it was a great point that this could be an area of savings over time. We have removed the technical education aid, the small school aid, and skipping down the universal learners or English learners services because those are now part of the foundation funding model through weights. We have left the EEE aid in. Flexible pathways are now also assumed to be part of the foundation funding and accounted for there. We made sure we had the funding available to keep that level of service. Universal school meals, there's an asterisk there that as of the budget or the governor's recommended budget, that's no longer a line item in there. So we've excluded that. And then we kept the remaining ones at the bottom the same as their current funding level. Oh, and I realized there's 2 rows for universal school meals. Apologize for having a duplicate there. So in total, the math for the total does not duplicate that amount, just so you know. But the difference there is about that 180 million that we were talking about earlier.
Viewed this slide before in terms of comparing this base amount to other states. So that concludes.
I had two, I had Senator Hinsdale and Senator Hardy,
Senator Gill.
and then I'll go to and then I'm looking down over here. Okay. Over here. So start here and move down, go there.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First, another appreciation. It reminds me a lot of when we attempted to advance universal health care, that we talked a lot about the unknowns, but we also had to remind ourselves to compare it to what is now. There's a lot of chaos in a system now with, we hear a lot about it with high school students maybe being displaced and, had to relearn in a Macy's, but really rose to the occasion, and having visited recently, saw how resilient those students were. In that context, I know sometimes when budgets go down, it really affects students feeling like the community doesn't necessarily believe in my education and my teachers. So, these are just really hard conversations about the cost of inaction as well. I really am trying to dig into table 12 or the appropriations one. And maybe this is going to be the appropriations committee's conversation, but this is the one where we kind of enumerate where you're getting these savings, right? So it's about $130 million just from the change in the formula, and then you're giving some back in other forms of aid. But I'd like to walk through a few more of these, because I think
What page?
page 19, where it's the table.
Yeah, table 12.
Table,
Got it.
there's two, it's also in the
Okay.
packet. This is where like a lot of large numbers are moved around that add up to some pretty big assumptions about how we get to $180 million of savings. And then how we might reinvest that, because, even when we merged from, I don't know, however many school districts to the number we have now, the small school merger support was never enough. So if we are asking for future savings, I see these things that are zeroed out that might be important to revisit. So I'm just curious if you can go through some of the areas that are zeroed out, and talk more about if that's real savings or you'd put it somewhere else.
Amanda, I think you can speak to that. I'll just say as a general statement, for the most part, they were zeroed out because we baked them into the formula. So,
Okay.
yeah, so I think
Except for universal school meals.
except for universal school meals, and that was because
That's part of the budget consideration from the governor's proposal.
Yeah.
Other adjustments are really shifting how we fund education. And so
Okay.
going line by line and understanding what is assumed to be part of that base funding amount. And then also what could be covered from that additional weight for those students that have greater needs. I do know that we have some additional, we have a lot of Excel files. And so I think we could walk through that mapping that was done to give you a little bit more background around how that was assumed, those assumptions were built in.
Okay, and I imagine each one would be a policy discussion in some committee, but I don't quite understand how tech ed with the base and formula amount you named what the reality would be of $18 million shifting in terms of how that's distributed.
And there's also, there's a pretty large CTE policy proposal that's baked into that we can share. I think it's an entire separate layer of kind of coming back and
But
talking
at
this
a high
through.
level,
But we
I think I
talk.
can, and speak to the ones
Yeah.
that we zeroed out. So that technical education, I think you just said it was 18 million. I apologize. I don't have it right in front of me. We zeroed out
17.9.
that line because part of the foundation formula is now fully funding CT as part of the foundation formula. And if you went back, I think a table from there, you'd see we're spending now about 75 million on CTE. Again, that is not an apples to apples comparison with that 18 because districts were paying tuition to CTE, and there's, a different payment structure currently. But so that line is zeroed out because we fully accounted for the cost within the foundation formula of CTE. Same with English learners, so that English learner services is zeroed out because we now have an English learner adjustment that's at a very robust level. And then the same with the small schools. Instead of a separate grant there, we have the small schools adjustment that is really increased from what you currently adjust for in your system now. So your system now adjusts for small schools less than 250 students, only in really sparse settings, when we're saying you should adjust for all small schools regardless of setting. And also all the way down to continuing to adjust down to schools that are smaller than 450 students. So it's a much larger adjustment for scale than you currently have. It's about, I think, ballpark like 4,000 extra weighted ADM in our size adjustment than current. But don't quote me exactly on that. That's very ballpark off the top of my head.
A lot of that is also embedded in the narrative description. I know that we haven't had an opportunity yet to dive into this report, but you're pointing to a really great item here in that this is not just about funding, right? This is about funding connected to policy decisions. And so I think we need to be really explicit around what those considerations were that went into each of those line items. This is our first attempt to do that within the narrative. And I think it can be helpful to, as you were describing it, maybe even having a table that's side by side so that we can clarify for this amount, these are the assumptions built in and the adjustments of where that would be reflected in the funding, the new funding system that's being proposed.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just have a couple of questions on your weight calculations. So the triple E, I'm confused as to why you would have a different weight for triple E than regular pre-K. And you seem to subtract it out, but then keep the categorical aid. And that I don't quite understand what you're doing there. So that's one of the weight. And then you also, the weights that you're using for the school size and district sparsity, it's the slide entitled Weights for School and District Characteristics. It seems to me that you're using the research from the UVM pupil weighting study to do that, but those are tax capacity weights. So how are you applying them to a foundation formula? Because that's definitely apples to oranges there. And then I don't understand the CTE weight and how you got the CTE weight and the sort of calculation you used for the CTE weight. So those four, I think, are for the weights.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. Remind me the first question. I think I got
The triple E and pre-K,
Oh, the triple
and
E
you're
and
backing it out, but then including yeah.
Yep. So in your current system, both pre-K students and triple E are counted as a 0.46, or the way it looks in your model is a negative 0.54 is how it's displayed.
Yeah.
Based on what we saw in the preschool report, that group, and I know you could speak to this much better, I believe you were part of that group, was that you wanted to count those students at least as a 1.0, that they should no longer be discounted. So we made that adjustment for pre-K. We left the triple E kind of negative adjustment as is because we didn't have other information to refer to. I think that's an area you could make a different policy choice to treat that as the same as preschool. I think there's more to unpack with how preschool services are provided at really young ages. My understanding of the appropriation, and Jill, Zoe, speak if I'm saying the wrong thing, I believe the way the the AOE team communicated it, is that's the funding associated with the special education services for those students. So that's why we left it as part of a separate categorical.
Yeah, so
Um,
that, the separate categorical makes sense, but excluding them from the increase in the weight does not make sense. They are actually the most at-risk preschoolers. And so if anybody should be counted more at a higher weight, it should be them. So I would just really encourage you not to do that separate thing for Triple E and include Triple E as part of your calculation for your preschool weights just in general, and also include the additional categorical aid, because that's compensating for the fact that those students have extra needs, they have additional needs. So you treat them like you would treat a regular K-12 preschool, special education student, where you're counting them as a full 1.0, adjusting for poverty and ELL if necessary, and then also on top of that, having the special education categorical aid. That's much more consistent with both the way we should treat preschoolers and the way we treat special education and other needs. So what about the,
One thing I would add just to preschool in terms of what's baked into the assumption. The committee recommended maintaining the current benefit for 3-year-olds and expanding the benefit for 4-year-olds to one FTE. So what's modeled in here is maintaining that 3-year-old benefit and then having the FTE increased for 4-year-olds.
wait, what do you mean by maintaining the 3-year-old? So would they still be at
benefit?
0.46, the 3-year-olds? So
That is how it's modeled, and I think you're.
How it's modeled.
I think I was
I
hearing
hear
the
your
recommendation
suggestion, I
was
just wanted
to
to-
not count them as that way, I think is what I was hearing. Is that correct?
I think it's just important to be consistent across all of them, and especially discounting Triple E is counterintuitive because they're the highest need students.
That makes sense.
And I think this is part of this, we're sort of telling
what
you
model-
exactly what's in there and then we
Yeah.
have the conversation.
I'm
right?
giving you my feedback.
Yeah,
I
that's
don't
great.
think it makes
Yep.
sense the way you have it. So, and then, so what about the sparsity or the ones that it seems like there was this for the district sparsity, it seems like you're using the current weights, which are tax capacity weights, instead of using your foundation weights.
And those considerations, we're looking at overall funding ranges. So I'll let you, Amanda, expand on that.
Yep. And I think we probably maybe say it a little more explicitly in the narrative. We are recommending using the current district sparsity weight because we don't have another source of information to create a separate weight for it at this time. So that one is the best information we have available. Again, acknowledging it was generated on this idea of tax capacity.
Yeah.
So it could merit further study. For the size adjustment, we used the both the current and the AVM AR study as a starting point of what adjustments may look like for scale. And then there's, in the report, you can see we went through a process to attempt to take the EB model and validate what the additional costs of size would be applying that model at smaller settings. To that end, we ended up with weights that were very similar to the 2019 AAR UVM weights. So we felt comfortable that even while those were tax capacity weights, the relationship they were representing was similar to what we were seeing if we had applied the EB model. I think it's an area that, again, you could consider if you need to change that weight to something else after having more time to dig into the data analysis or speak to the field. But for what we could do with the available research that was out there, we felt that those were representative of the differences in costs that we would expect to see.
Okay.
But
It's
again,
just,
great
it's,
caveat that they are tax capacity weights.
yeah, they're tax,
Of an
that's
orange.
not, they're not the same thing.
But they
Yeah,
were
we didn't have an
validated.
apple to look at, if you will.
Yeah, okay, what about the CTE weight? Can you walk me through how you got
Let
there?
Justin do that one.
Absolutely. For CTE, we've been doing study on CTE first for the legislature and continued work for AOE for it's like 2 years now. And so we looked at the median cost of providing CTE across the state. We then looked at that by higher performers, lower performers, different settings and came out with effectively the median cost is about $25,000 per student to provide CTE center-based programming. So we use that as our cost figure. What we recognize is that students will still be, enrolled in their home district. That district's going to be getting the base cost. So you have to, so what we're looking at is that weight, which produces the majority of the CTE funding, and then on behalf payment, which would be the rest, which would go to the BOCES. So the cost is really based on the current cost structures to provide center-based CTE instruction.
So is it 25,000 on top of the 13,000 base?
No, it's 25,000. So in the end, the total funding for each of those FTE would be about 30,000. 25 of that is going to CTE. 5 of that is remaining at the home district because the things that aren't accounted for in the CTE center are some incurred costs that districts keep because they give a diploma to that student. They're doing the guidance counseling for that student. What we also are providing is some funding to ensure that some of the scale issues that have been identified throughout the CTE study process, where when you lose one student, or let's say 4 students are going to CTE, it could be harder to have high-level AP courses because you just don't have as many kids in the school. So it keeps some of that additional funding to the local school to get rid of the tension that currently exists between sending districts and CTE. So it's really to accomplish both. And there is another policy brief coming out on that, which will lay all that out.
And I'm assuming it's adjusted for FTE.
Yes, so it's all FTE. So you, as you all know, some students are half-time, right? And so it's based on the FTE, not on headcount.
Okay. Okay, I'm gonna mull this. Thank you.
Thank you.
My question might be fairly quick. We have a small but mighty community school program in Vermont that helps our most economically disadvantaged kids. And I think it's been very successful, really meeting their needs in very creative ways. How does this new system take into account that community school model?
One of the things we looked at, this is an evidence-based model, so we built in assumptions around how you could staff that model. There's adjustments there where you could hire a community schools coordinator to meet that same need. So that's the type of flexibility that's built into the system. So even as a district, they might look at the budget differently for different schools depending on those needs. But that was an explicit conversation that we had around, how might you make these adjustments to fund a community schools coordinator? Because, in the pilot study that we have engaged in, we're seeing some really promising results. This whole model is a whole child approach. And part of that is also engaging community partners to do that effectively. Having a designated person at the school, it really helps. So that could be one of those roles that would be identified as a need, and you'd have the flexibility to make those adjustments at the ground level.
Yeah, and as part of that explicit goal, our community schools programs survive on grant funding. And the grants always end and they're always scrambling to continue. And so that was an active conversation that we had, is how could we build that in so that those schools could have that. I had a great conversation with the superintendent from a school that runs a community school. We sort of laid this out and we talked about it. And I said, this was an explicit goal. And his response was, oh, yeah, I can see that. I can see how we would continue to fund that. And he said, really, the community schools, it's not necessarily a lot of additional costs. It's just the framework of how you approach it. And he said, so yes, we could continue to do this work with this kind of base. And I was very pleased to hear that because it was a goal.
The weights also for those students that are in poverty would also drive that, and being able to fund after school programs, before school programs, to have that wraparound. So we really did have a lot of conversation around how does this achieve that whole child approach? And in our higher poverty communities, how could a model like community schools really be supported by this approach?
Should be quick. Do you have a consolidation plan?
Good question. So can you expand your question?
So like in my district, I have Middlebury, Virgins, and Mount Abe, and they're under very few students, and they've talked of pushing one in either Mount Abe into Virgins, and I know up in the Northeast Kingdom. They got a couple schools that are less than 12 miles apart with the same thing going on.
I
So-
drove it.
Yeah.
I clocked it.
So to be transparent, it's like, and I believe we all know that it has to happen to make our numbers work. And so do you have a plan?
So we've heard a lot from local communities that are trying to engage in this work that it's so hard to make these decisions. We know that that's one of the hardest decisions that a community can make to consolidate a school. And they're often asking for cover from the state. You know, how do we do this in a way that's fair and that we're following some criteria that we've established as a state? I think the first step is really being clear around that criteria to make sure that it's focused both on achieving educational quality and also financial viability. This plan is assuming you can provide a very robust education. To do that, there's scale involved in delivering. And so we need to be clear around that criteria, and it needs to be measurable. And then in a way that we can also support with the options that will help you to achieve the scale to deliver that option. We have had conversation too about this needing to be very practical. We know that there are some small schools that are small by necessity, and we also need to be clear about that criteria as well as we go into this work. So I think the next step is really establishing the criteria. Another key piece of this is making sure that that transition results in better opportunities for students. So a key policy consideration is how do we do that planning and document that change is really producing better options, better opportunities, a better school environment for students. This is designed to allow us to do that in a very planful and intentional way. Right now, I think a lot of these decisions are being contemplated under very high stress, tight timelines. And so this allows us to be more intentional, more planful, but also really precise in how we would measure the viability of the school to support the new districts in doing that work of consolidation to achieve better opportunities for students.
Thank you. It was a long answer, but thank you.
I also. Because we're getting into like how many schools, right? Like that's going to depend on your enrollment. It's going to depend on the current infrastructure. Like where do you have schools? So, you know, part of that criteria will be commute time. Part of that criteria will look at facility condition. So all of those things, I think that'll be an important next step for us really to flesh out. We'll bring some recommendations on what we think that criteria should be. And then I think within your own, experience in your community, you can help to really bring color to that. Is that the right way to approach this? And we want to make sure that it's fair. And we hear that pretty consistently across the state. Like, how do we engage in these really difficult, really emotional conversations in our community if another community doesn't have to do that? And then again, for us at the agency, it's about better opportunities for students. It can't just be change for change's sake, but change to make improvements.
Well, I'll point out that about 100 years ago, we had to do this with closing down individual schools to start coming in. So
Yeah.
Vermont's done it once. I'm sure we can do it again.
We actually have this, at some point you need to share it with everyone. We have this amazing state board report from like 1869 that is literally listing every
same challenges.
single one of these challenges. We were just like a little bit blown away. Like,
Yes.
oh, we've been doing this for a while.
We'll
But
bring that report next
I
time.
think also we're very actively working. As communities are having these conversations, it cannot just be a narrative of loss.
Right.
And so how do we bring in other partners, other resources, other visions for, if you cannot really support a very small school, what can be brought into that community so that the community is thriving? And one of our really explicit goals as we're doing this work is about supporting our small rural communities and how do we help them to be thriving communities. That may not be with a very small school if you have a small school just down the street. That doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have a thriving community. How do we actually do that work? And that involves a lot more partners. It involves questions around the healthcare system and economic development and housing. So it's all very complex work, but our focus is always about the student. The student is right there at the center of what we're doing.
Did you have another question?
I
I did if we have time, but I'm assuming we'll get another crack at this.
Many more.
Yes. We did volunteers tribute at the beginning. I've heard us say that, so.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
do you want me to wait or do we have time?
So 3 or 3:30?
The other piece that
Yeah, but-
we've talked a lot about the students, and we know an important component of that is also make sure they have access to a high quality teacher, which is why this proposal is also focusing on teacher salary and particularly teacher pay equity. We've seen across the state that our smaller supervisor unions have higher needs and they tend to pay their teachers less. So we know that there's great disparity. So when you think comprehensively about this approach, it would allow a teacher across the state of Vermont to be able to earn a competitive wage. And if we couple that with some of the housing initiatives, they would be able to move into those communities that are going to become really vibrant economic centers. And so that's also part of the intentionality of this and where this dovetail with some of the conversations around housing and broader economic development efforts.